Good afternoon. My name is Gregory Critchlow, and I'm in the actual Department of Environmental Design, just across the street. So we have just actually joined with CMCI. So now we are negotiating being a department as opposed to a program, which we've been since the 60s actually. But we are architecture, we are planning, landscape, and product design. And so we actually allow the students to get a taste of 4 of the different disciplines, and then encourage them to really understand what they want to do in the last 2 years. So the first 2 years, they get a kind of a broad level, and then the last 2 years they focus. And then some students will go on and pursue some kind of internship or work, but a good portion of students will try to enhance that focus even more in graduate study as well. Especially on the architecture side, because our accreditation, for them to get accredited, they need to go down to Denver or any other graduate program to get a professional degree. Not the case for planning, landscape, or product design. But anyway, so I'm here to discuss about the research that I'm doing there. And what I'd like to discuss first is how I actually came to the point where I am now, because it all has this relationship back to my ultimate goal. The research I do at some point here with students is more technical, but my ultimate goal has a more of a social component to it. And so I start with citizen. So as I'm a registered architect, I actually did my undergrad here in the 90s. And then I went off to University of Illinois, Chicago to do the graduate program in architecture, practice in Chicago, practice in Colorado. But one of the things that I really discovered when I was in Chicago was that I am from Colorado, and the actual social context of Colorado isn't nearly as varied as when I was in Chicago. So I lived in Oak Park in Chicago. So I had the opportunity to move to the west side of Chicago. And if you're familiar with the demographics or the geographics of Chicago, the west and south side are not doing as well. And for me, especially as a person of color, coming from Colorado, I wasn't really understanding the whole picture. And so when I was seeing all these different edges, the edge of buildings that looked like they were condemned or burnt out that I was experiencing here in Colorado, I was looking at these kind of structures and saying, there's no way that no one could be living in these. And then you see people pop up in windows and still inhabiting those things. But then, doing my projects in school, especially in graduate school, I was visiting these just beautifully manicured residences with carriage houses that the help still lives in, that I was really befuddled because we didn't have that kind of opulence in Colorado, or it had been subdivided to some degree. And so, but what was really interesting, and what I like to show this collage, is that this edge is not so much different than the real edge that you see in Chicago. So it could be just a street like Halsted that divides these 2 different cultural divisions. And so as a person of color, it really, really resonated with me, because what I was seeing in these windows were people that looked like myself. And then what I was trying to attain in graduate school was a relationship with the residents that are on those edges. And so how do I really start to comprehend coming to some kind of truth with myself? So after graduate school, though, my wife and I decided that we would return to Colorado because I've grown up here. She is actually from Chicago, but I didn't want to feel like I was running away from this, right? And so how could I make a difference when I came back? And so what I did, so when I returned back to Colorado, I actually practiced architecture under a couple different firms, but I focused in on a lot of nonprofit projects. And so the first project I'll show you, and I'll run through the architecture quick because I'd like to get the research, but the first project is a gathering place, and it is a women's day shelter on Colfax and High Street. And it is a space for our homeless population, specifically women, to go to during the day. Because if you're familiar with shelters, you check in at 5:30, but you promptly have to check out at 7:30 in the morning. And so there's an issue of safety and what to do during those hours of the day, especially for women. And so I was working with a firm and I became the lead architect, design architect for this particular project. But what really made me really buy into or take ownership of the project is that I had to gain the trust of the actual clientele of the project, because men aren't allowed in this space. So if you are designing the space, you really have to listen. And one of the first things I did was I actually took the number 15 to every meeting. So that's the bus that runs up and down Colfax. And that became almost an informal meeting between me and clients. And so we'd have these formal meetings like, what do you want to see in a building? And a lot of times you get these guarded answers because there are the staff there. But when you're on the bus and they start to see you take that time, they would start to come up to you and start to talk about the project, which is was really quite gratifying for me and hopefully for the end product of the project. So here's the project in its entirety. It started out as a 10,000 square foot building. The actual end product was 30,000 square feet because unfortunately our issue of homelessness is not declining, it's increasing. But what some of the things we did was when I was in Chicago at graduate school, the big thing with a lot of these civic buildings was green roofs. So I took a lot of that learning process when I was in Chicago and did it to this particular building, applied to this particular building. So on this part, you'll have more of your public space. And on the backside, we did we did domestic solar hot water. You can see a plan for the roof. So again, for more of the public space, we added a full-size playground, a lot of green space and quiet space for the women. And then back here is your domestic solar hot water. It provided a childcare, but the childcare was on the second floor because they had no interest in being a licensed daycare, because that meant a client could come drop their child off and leave, but they needed them to be there full time to take advantage of all the services. They had services like GED training, job application, billing, all these services that women could take part of, and even artwork, full commercial kitchen. So that was another skill building set. And then again, just a photo of what was on the green roof at this point. And so this is starting to understand what it is to be not only just a professional as an architect, but what it is to be a citizen and really understand some of the things that are going on around us in our society. Second project I will show quickly is this is the fourth quarter. So our mayor at the time was Mayor Hickenlooper. He was trying to understand the Denver roll home, trying to eliminate homelessness in 10 years. Did not happen, but this is one of the first projects. And again, I was the design lead architect on this one with the firm I was with. The biggest thing about this project is it started out as more of a public project or private project, but turned into a project that was invested by the VA. And so now 85% of this building are veterans who are trying to reacclimate into society, who have a hard time right now. Again, so some of the things that we learned in terms of these informal interviews, we wanted to provide a very open courtyard. So all the shared corridors are well lit because veterans, one of the biggest things they do not like are hidden corners. And so we are just trying to make sure that we tried to eliminate as many as we could. We took advantage of the roof again, not necessarily such a green roof, but more of a center for getting together. And then as opposed to domestic hot water, we actually did solar voltaic on this particular project. And our design was very on a pretty small budget, but what we did in terms of trying to make it a little bit different than more of your public projects is we started to make small choices. So as opposed to just your generic white appliances, we changed the color, did not increase. We, a lot of times as designers, we just assume that, we have these choices and that increases the cost. It does not, but it gives a little bit of ownership to the end user. But the one thing I must say about this, and I say this to my students all the time, especially as burgeoning designers or even architects, is that you really have to understand what the artifact is after the project is done, because my post-occupancy review of this was on the front page, or in the paper, as one of the most dangerous buildings in Denver. Because of mismanagement. The VA at the time, and it probably still is, going through money issues. We're not probably providing the appropriate management. And so a lot of the outside unfortunate situations are coming into the building, a lot of dealing, prostitution, all these kind of things. And so the reason why I sit with this so much is because I live in this neighborhood. And this project was really contentious about the review board because they thought it would just bring bad things. And so you really have to tell students that I don't know if there's much that I could do as an architect, but you have to learn from the next project and have those communications, not with just end users, but who's managing. You know, how is this building going to be dealt with as we move into the future? And so it's getting better, but it could, you know, to have that in the paper as a designer resonates with you, okay? But you have to show the good and the bad.
So how does your job doing this type of project, how closely do you work with the urban planners so that, and the city in general, so that you might end up with a more holistic approach where you say, look, if safety is gonna be an issue for these reasons, how do we get everybody to work together so this is a holistic project instead of just an architectural project?
That's a good question. Well, the city doesn't really have that conversation. It's more about property management. It's more that conversation of the VA. I mean, the city can, I mean, we zoned it for Main Street, so we actually, when we went through all the approvals through the city and the neighborhood groups, they tried to actually shut the project down, the neighborhood groups did, and they said, first we had to change the zoning to Main Street, because they felt that if you go back to this particular picture, so that added this actual story, which is more of a storefront, so more of a pedestrian presence. So more eyes on the street kind of opportunities. And then they also, so that added project costs. We were able to get that done. We did everything they asked for, and they backed out of the agreement. And so when the building was open, the VA was working with a private management company, and they didn't have enough of, I would say, security. They didn't have enough presence. I mean, as the neighborhood in itself already had its issues.
So I think I asked that question the wrong way.
Yeah,
If you were to start again, if
Yeah.
you know only enough, you could go back in time and do it again. What would be different? What would you do differently? How would you make this successful where it looks like it's project?
Or is it possible that the NIMBY thing is such a difficult problem for communities that, you know, you always have to take things with a grain of salt?
I hate hearing stuff like this, right? And I always want to know, wait a minute, this didn't have to be this way, right?
yeah, it didn't. And the conversation would have to be more with the VA and who they're going to hire to manage the company, and how, to be honest, the management company, there's some nepotism. And so a child or sibling took over the management and wasn't very qualified to do that. How do I say this diplomatically? And so, but the VA had other things to worry about. I mean, they're building a brand new hospital at the time, and so they weren't monitoring what was happening. By the time it happens, you know, it's too late. It's way too late. But I've done other projects like the Gathering Place in a similar neighborhood where there has no issues, but I worked directly with the staff to make sure that things were well taken care of at that point. So yes, to say what I would do to reverse it, that would be the biggest thing. But then, yes, when the NIMBY piece got it into the paper, right?
Right.
And so that's the thing that really kind of exacerbated the whole thing.
Because they were saying, I told you so.
Yes, exactly. But what was here were these rundown buildings, and at the time, the person that owns the property was bringing recently incarcerated constituents to these houses so they could reacclimate. And what he wanted to do, more formalized understanding of how to do that, as opposed to being these dilapidated buildings. And one of the things that they tried to put a roadblock was Neil Cassidy of Jack Kerouac's supposedly spent a night in one of these buildings, and so they wanted to have it historically registered. So, yeah, they were
You know what
reaching.
that's called urban, development equals, if it possibly can go wrong, it usually will.
But, you know, and another argument was that we want coffee shops, we want flower shops, we want all these things, you know, and meanwhile, the same constituent base that was talking about this was investing hundreds and thousands of dollars in adjacent properties because they were able to buy these houses, scrape them and build what they wanted to, but they weren't willing to invest in bringing what they wanted to. They thought if they moved in here, all this would come. It doesn't really happen that way, right? Well, it's a slow process. It's happening now because the neighborhood's completely changed. But at the time that this was built, it wasn't gonna happen that way. Yeah.
It's a great, great allegory for, the politics and, the tension between state, local, and federal government and funding programs, and it's a,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, yeah, it was a challenging project, but, you know, we, again, being a neighbor in this neighborhood and listening to my neighbors tell me, how awful this project is, you really understand where people are starting to come from, right? At some point, they're very cordial to you, but at another point, they have another alternative or agenda at some point.
Hey, Greg, I'll just
Yeah.
finish it off by saying one thing. I'm not gonna mention his name, but there's a person I know who used to be very active in ULI, Colorado. And they said, never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And most of that ends up happening over time. And I never really understood what that was until I heard about this other, anyway, something in North Denver. But point is that, he says that the biggest hurdle is always finding the capital to build the structure, especially if it's in a, a margin of one of those two neighborhoods you mentioned.
Yeah.
And, it's never easy. That is what he told me.
Yeah.
And the reason I know about that is because I was trying to help a friend with a project. It's interesting to hear you speak about this. It must have been a great learning experience. Once the pain subsided a little bit.
Well, this project, if you would go to the neighborhood now, you would not recognize the neighborhood anymore. So this project's just another building in that kind of piece, but yes. Okay, so actually, see if I can go, oh, yes. So 2009 hits. That project was 2008, 2009 hits. Architecture, the Great Recession. Usually I talk to students, so no one really understands what I'm talking about, but you all understand what I'm talking about. So everybody was getting laid off. The question wasn't when you're gonna get laid off. As you know, design cycles, project finishes, you might find another project in the firm, or you just go to another firm, and nothing was happening like this. And so again, within the same neighborhood, I had to reevaluate and really ask myself what I wanted to do, as opposed to wait for this industry to come back. I actually reinvested in myself, reinvented in that neighborhood again. And so I decided to do something that I had a passion for, and that was biking. And so maybe 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks after I was laid off, I took my wife to this corner and I said, look, this could be our future. And so, I have to give her credit, she's very understanding. But my idea was to do a bike shop in this neighborhood that ordinarily would not open a bike shop. And so I knew the building owner here because our firm was just around the corner. And this is a 400 square foot space. As you can see, there's no roof, there's no electrical, no plumbing. And then if you go into this fenced off area, there's a stair down there. Unfortunately, addicts were using it as a restroom. So there had to be a lot of work that had to be done. And so I had to convince the building owner, there's an idea that could be happening here. So once we did that, and being in business, you have to understand your overhead. But the first thing I did as a designer for this was I took the bars off the windows and the door, because that really says a lot about something in this neighborhood. And I wanted to say that there's nothing that inside is more important than the people that are outside the neighborhood. Okay, and so after that, we took probably 3 months, and this is what it became.
Nice.
And the reason I say 3 months, because everybody's like, how do you do that in 3 months? I didn't permit it. As an architect, I knew that I was gonna do everything up to code, but I knew if I had to do a permit, it just, the neighborhood needed something right then, it couldn't wait. And I know from experience, you know, if something is awry or someone calls, they make you pay the permit fee as long as you're within code. So that's how I was able to get it done in a more valuable time. But I did all the interior, and then the building owner did all the superstructure, so he put the roof, the electrical, and the plumbing back into the building. And so this is what it came, just a small little 400 square foot shop. And so we were doing this for about 4, 5, after about 6 months. I had these two gentlemen approach me at the front door. And this, you know, in some respect, is a little bit of a comical picture. But what was happening was that these two gentlemen came, the solid rubber wheel came off the wheelchair, they couldn't push it down. So they came to me and said, can you fix this? And the urgency came because if you can look, he's an amputee, so he has no feet, so he's holding himself up here. And so it became very tense as he was screaming, I gotta get back in the chair. And finally, after, you know, about 20 minutes of trying to get this thing back on, we got it back on, pulled his pants up, put it back in the chair. And he looked at me and he said, well, how much do we owe you for this? It's like, you know, this wasn't in my business plan. I don't know, right? But they knew the value and they wanted to support, right? And it came to me because they figured bikes do with wheels, they understood this. And so now I started to understand that what I was doing was beyond or transcending beyond just transactional. It wasn't just a bike shop anymore. It was a space for the neighborhood. And therefore started to understand, okay, being a citizen, right? Yes, I have skill sets to offer, but what else can I offer in terms of the rehabilitation or the reinvestment in a neighborhood? What is that value? So after a year, the building owner approached and said, you know, I have this corner property here attached to it. Would you like to move into it? After doing the numbers, we were able to make it work. So this became the retail. So now we're more open to the neighborhood. And then I kept the actual other space because I designed and fabricated the product. So that was the unique part about the shop.
So is your shop on the other side?
Yeah, so, oops, sorry. I'm losing my space here. Okay, so yes, here's the shop.
On the backside.
And then, yeah, so it's, if you go, it's right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can see the skis and everything.
Yeah, right there.
So this becomes the retail, so this becomes a bigger connection. What was really great about having this larger connection was that we would have everybody from, actually gang members that were getting their bikes worked on, to stapled in moms in the same space, right? And it was interesting because they would have this conversation inside the shop where they would normally not talk to each other outside the shop. And the commonality was just, I have a bike, you know, what are you working on? Someone would say, oh, that's a nice bike, I got it from here, and this conversation would happen. It was just really kind of an interesting understanding at that point. And so again, this space meant more than just transaction. So here, just pointing out, yes, this is what made our shop unique. We weren't just a bike shop. I actually designed and fabricated all the product there. So all the bikes you saw that came out of the shop was in our workshop. So, but a lot of people were questioning, well, is this for the neighborhood? And it's a small business. You have to think business-like. You want to bring people in, because yes, I could barely afford one of my bikes. Actually, I couldn't afford one of my bikes. But it brought people in and really recognized the neighborhood at that point, kept me open to do other things within the neighborhood. So some of the things, so these are some of the bikes that went out. This was a person that was an adventure journalist. He received the bike within, on a Thursday, went on a 500-mile bike ride the following week. I was kind of nervous about that. He didn't get a lot of time to test, but he was good. This is a helicopter nurse who wanted an everyday bike that was around town. Again, this is actually, when I call him the neighborhood philanthropist, he actually lives in the neighborhood, a gentleman of color, has quite a bit of money, and he just gave me $500 a year previous, said, whenever you're ready, make me a bike. So he came to me in a year and we made him a bike. This is a person who buys or purchases Bentleys as a hobby. And he actually came to me maybe about the following summer, and said, I rode that bike every day. And so it starts to change the culture, it starts to change personality. This one was interesting because I made this for a gentleman who works at Botanical Garden. But the reason I include this one, because you can see it's all decked out in brooks, right? And so when you have a story, when you have a narrative, when you have a purpose, people really find out about it. And so we had the outdoor show in Denver at the convention center. And so Brooks from England reached out to us before they came and said, we've heard about your shop. We heard what you're doing. We want one of your bikes so we can put all our gear on it. And then part of the deal is that you can retain all that gear. So this is about $1,500 worth of gear. And so I just gave the bike back to the owner with all the gear on it. But what the point is that the word was getting out of what we were doing, right? It was extending beyond the neighborhood of 5 Points, Denver, and so that was really encouraging to understand how a narrative can do that. So the end goal for the shop was that we switched from the name Chocolate Spokes, and we did sell chocolate, bean-to-bar chocolate in the shop, but extending from the name Chocolate Spokes to 5 Point Cycles, because we started to, we started in a relationship with high schools to bring in students to learn the process, to learn machining, welding, learning how to fabricate. The schools thought we were just teaching them how to be mechanics. But I realized this when one of the students did their final presentation and was under the hood, was welding, and the counselor pulled me aside and said, I don't think our insurance covers this. And so, but the student wanted to learn this, but we wanted to produce a fabrication bike, right? So something that was not just a custom, what I was doing, fitting each individual, but a off the line bike and get people involved. So, but at this point that we were starting to do this, I actually started teaching at the University of Kansas. And so, because they wanted me to share that narrative there. So I was never really able to do this within that space. So we're still working to get there. So today, at the Environment School of Environmental Design. So one of the things I've done in terms of the research is started through my courses, and looking at transit, not only just what we've done in terms of how it could potentially bring back a corner in a neighborhood, but I want my students to question what the infrastructure is currently. And so I have this studio called Scale, Movement, and Equity. And so what we look at, it's a multidisciplinary studio. And so we take people from architecture, planning, product design, and landscape in all one studio. And so what we start with is the fabric of the infrastructure, and we look at it and say, what is wrong? Why aren't we pursuing alternative transit spaces right now? Is it because of policy? Is it because of the actual physical space? So we analyze that. And then we get into looking at the actual, we have to have an architecture component because it is a multidisciplinary studio. And so what I do to get students to think about the humanitarian or human process is that the actual architecture program is a public restroom, because we don't do that very well in the United States. And so the public restroom is about not only just the humanity of it, but public, how can we combine charging stations, spaces that start to stitch other spaces together. So getting them to think beyond just a physical space like that. And so you can start to see some of the results students came up with. This is the McGuckins. So you can hear this is McGuckins. And so what I do is I assign Folsom as the corridor, and each student group picks a intersection to redevelop. This particular group pick the parking lot or the two intersections that are adjacent to McGuckins. And so they actually started to reevaluate the parking spaces in McGuckins and turned it into more of a public space, which starts to transition into more of the pedestrian way. So this is their restroom area. And so they start to zone it differently. And what I do is I tell students, because we talk to the city, and as you know, in the students think the city is gonna come and say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. But the city's actually like, we want all those ideas because it has to start big before we can make those small steps. And so, yes, you know, in some reality, this is a big stretch, but it could lead to some more of a thought process. And then, you know, our students are starting to take more visuals, starting to understand what representation is. I give them the standard architectural understanding so they get some skill sets. So rendering, what does it feel like to be in these spaces? We go through the process diagram of what their conceptual designs are. So we do all the design processes, and then we give our landscape studios, so they have to be able to understand what trees would thrive there, what is their opportunity to for summer or seasonal growth or seasonal protection. And then they actually have to incorporate, our product designers actually incorporate a vehicle. And we actually say a human-powered vehicle. But what I try to do, because a lot of students will come to me and say, I want to build a bike frame, right? And I'm like, I've done that. But how can we start to, because in our culture, we think bikes as more recreational, not as an everyday. And so we start looking at it as a vehicle. How can we start to, you know, have protection from the elements? How can we make the exertion a little bit less? And so really trying to push students to say, okay, how do we get into it, but still have it human powered with some assist, of course. And so now our product designers are engaged. I mean, everybody's engaged in the whole project because they get to learn different aspects of it. But this is where they start to take over and understand what the vehicle design is. We start to understand, so here's your public restroom, but then, you know, you can travel through it. We have parking, we have charging. And so it really becomes an engaging project for all disciplines to really be involved in. And then here is, of course, being the architect, I make them do models. And so, but they start to really, the students really take ownership of it. You know, some students will be very ambivalent because it is a public restroom, but then when they see the possibilities, but I also show them other countries do design competitions around this kind of stuff. They choose beautiful pieces. And so this is one of the built pieces that we do. Of course, in the architecture, we have to teach them how to detail, but as opposed to just draw, I wanted to build it so they understand thickness, those kind of understanding. So, and then the next studio that I did this last fall, so I created this one last spring, and I created another one this fall. So EPOP 3100, so our product design. So now, as opposed to doing all the landscape, the planning and the architecture, we just focused on the vehicle itself. And so again, getting our students to understand what it is to take it from sketch to a tangible idea is something that we really have to keep working on with students, because with the digital technology, everybody just wants to hop on the computer. And they lose the idea of what it is to really, not the imperfection of sketch, the imperfection of idea, right? And so from sketch, they start to develop ideas. And so what we do is we scaffold the semester from everything from vehicle rider compartment to the transmission to suspension, wheels, drivetrain, everything like that. So they have at least 2.5 weeks to study, really get into each part of the bike. And so they actually will model every piece. And then eventually we'll actually put it all together in the final model. And so unfortunately, I don't have someone standing next to it, but the models are this big, right? And so these are kind of 1 to 10, and I have them do 1 to 5 for the final model. So it's a very sizable model. And they work in groups of 2 to get this done. And so a lot of this, I teach them to work with clay. So they work with the automobile modeling clay. Some of them, some of these are 3D printed, some of them are clay, and then how to finish. So actually, what I'd like to do is develop a whole understanding of how do we make this into more of a focus for students. So here are some more model renderings. So we're still working on model quality, but they're getting there. So some more. And so again, at the end of the semester, we bring in professionals. So we had this gentleman's from Gates Rubber, so the belt drive division. We bring in Boulder Transit to come in. We brought in CU Transit to just have these discussions, to see what these ideas are. What are the possibilities? So this first semester that I did it, the design parameter was, okay, what would be your ideal vehicle? So we didn't have the context of the city in this particular semester. So if some group they did an off-road vehicle, this vehicle that you just saw was more performance. But the opportunity to do it next fall, I want to reach out to one of our professionals and, for instance, B-Cycle, and say, let's design a vehicle for B-Cycle, a shared vehicle. Because in all intents and purpose, these vehicles will probably be more expensive than a used vehicle. And so if you have a shared vehicle, then you're not adding another piece into your garage at that point. So to move forward, so when I was at the University of Kansas, I was able to set up this lab with all my equipment, and I was able to work with students to do real-time one-to-one projects. And so you can see here, again, students like, help me build a frame. So we build a frame. I would like to do the same thing that I was starting to do in Kansas, but take those human-powered vehicles to real-time understanding, right? And so now, as opposed to a model this big, I want you to be able to sit into it, to have a prototype, to be able to use it, to see what's going on. And actually, I'd like to engage not only just our students, but mechanical engineering or other students that are really trying to have the knowledge to make it all work. So I equate it to a Formula One race team, right? It's called a constructor team. And so they make everything, gears, they make everything but the engine, right? Everything else is made. So here, I'd like our students to have that engagement, because our students are really focused on the aesthetic and the user experience. And so reaching out to the engineering or other departments that would know how to make this work, okay? That was one of the questions that my students had this semester. Do I have to know how to make this work? We'll work on the aesthetics, okay? And so another thing, in terms of that research, so at Kansas, we had a 60,000 square foot warehouse to do a lot of design build in. And so I was working with a colleague, and he built this house for design build as a space of a caregiving. And so he was looking at aging populations. And so what he was doing is putting accelerometers into the floor joist. He was using toilets that were measuring hydration, all these different smart appliances. And the accelerometer, so for instance, his deal was that if your gait tells a certain point of stroke, so we mostly walk heel to toe, but if you start to drop and you're starting to go toe to heel, it could be a sign of stroke or initial stroke. And so this particular piece would go out to the appropriate caregiver and say, we need to keep an eye on this person. But we started having these conversations about, okay, what if we started to incorporate not only just as a age in place, but almost as a preventative space. And so developing a vehicle that would start to plug into something like this and start to engage with these appliances, have touch points to understand what it would be, okay, if you expended this much energy or you need this much intake, so smart refrigerators telling you if you purchase this, this, and that, you'll have that particular output. And so all these back and forth between architecture and transit. And so ultimately developing a lab or some kind of institute that we could start to bring those two together. Space, of course, we don't have a 60,000 square foot warehouse yet. But those ideas to present to our students, not only in environmental design, but engineering as well. Another thing that we looked at was, what is it to engage with the everyday transit talked to a few people over in the KU Medical using an EEG into a helmet and quantifying, is there a actual benefit in terms of mental health, riding a bike for 2 weeks or driving a car for 2 weeks? We didn't quite get there yet, but those are ideas I'd love to get there right here.
It's a great place to just jump in and ask a really simple question. How, obviously, there's, you know, a future of transit and a future of shared housing and shared transit here, and that's a great starting point. But in the context of really, in a premeditated way, starting to build on those concepts to create a more connected, more intelligent community and, you know, housing environment. Was that conscious on the front end of this, or did you sort of move into that, you know, creating the other components? I'm just sort of curious about the morphology of what occurred when was the light bulb, before or after, I guess?
To get into more of this kind of understanding.
Right.
So it was actually, when I went to Kansas, because Kansas doesn't, it was just purely architecture. So I was trying to wedge in there with my kind of understanding of what it is for transit. And so I was trying to justify my space there. And this is a great kind of connection to do that. And then it became just, okay, this is really possible. Because what was happening with my colleague's project is that the insurance companies were really ready to fund this, because they're like, the lower we can, the
The
less people.
actuaries
Yeah.
liked your numbers.
Yes, right, and so now, you know, how can we roll that in? So that was so to answer your question, this came as kind of trying to get my way into, where do I fit at Kansas? Because Kansas is a 5-year accredited architecture program. So coming here gives me a lot more freedom to like really investigate this and encourage to investigate this. Because we're not so tied to the in-car understanding of what it is for a student to graduate.
And just feedback wise, it's just a wonderful thing to cross across the top of those silos between transit and housing and community. And I don't mean like immediate community where you live, I mean the people in a local community who are sort of in governance, who support the tax base, who collect the taxes. That's a really great picture.
And well, so one of the things to finish of the talk was that, so I've talked about all this research, especially at the university level, but if I go back to 2801 Downing, where I started the shop, right? What I want to do with students is actually develop a prototype that we could take back and look at another corner that needs to be reinvested in, and pick up where I was at with 5-point cycles and say, okay, how can we make a fabrication center on another corner, right? I didn't want to go back and make another shop or retail space, but a fabrication space to really engage a neighborhood about what it is to participate in what's coming in the future, right? What gives value to a neighborhood, right? So at this point, we're developing a prototype, but the end goal is to take that prototype into another corner. And then both on the architecture side, so if we were able to go, as you saw, I had to do a lot of work on that corner. There's a lot of corners that have to do a lot of work. And so, especially in architecture, we do a lot of study abroad. And we build these great spaces in other countries, but there's a lot of spaces here that need work. And so if we start to understand a concept of what I like to look at as a domestic study abroad, and have an immersive process where I take students to a 5 points. And they don't just come back to Boulder, but we can arrange with community leaders to have them stay there for a semester and work on some of these spaces to build these fabrication centers. But then we have a prototype to introduce. And so there's this whole cycle that I'd love to come back to, but I have to take it one step at a time. Right now, I'm in the very technical weeds. I started in the very social understanding, getting to the technical. Now I need to bring the two together. And so the rest of the talk is just about the organization of neighborhoods, you know, what is institutionalized, understand demographics, understand density, what supports that, what's the financial compensation, you know, how do we redo this again, but with a purpose? When I did it was a selfish purpose. I needed work. I needed to rediscover myself. But how do I engage the university and neighborhoods because again, we do design projects in the neighborhood and we create artifacts that they can't necessarily afford to keep. they become something that is, for instance, we do parks or we do these open space projects, and then you go back in 5 years. And if the community doesn't have the time or the resources, it just becomes a degraded artifact. How can we put something in that a community can take ownership and sustain itself on, and create some kind of, for lack of a better word, wealth generation at that point. So that is my presentation, and that's where I'm at right now, here in Boulder. So it's good to talk to everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm open for questions or discussion.
I want to share a story for why you're in the right spot. So 30 years ago, when I was in college here, Spence Havlick was teaching part of the core curriculum in environmental design and was on city council. And the project in the class when I was there, when I attended his class, was there were sort of group projects to address one of the highest risk intersections in Boulder, and also to address parking problems on campus. And we're 30 years later. Some of the designs that came out of that class included a crosswalk at Broadway and Euclid. Maybe you've been under a crosswalk. The other thing is that the hop and all of the bus transit are things that are obvious to me because I was in the class, derived from a think tank of some number of generations of students through Spence's class, and then his influence in city council to be able to make some projects happen in the city. So that happened at environmental design in this town, and we got one of the best architectural interventions I've seen in my sort of experience as an architecture student in that underpass at Broadway. So the fact that you did this already in Denver, and there is a tension between the CU Denver and CU Boulder environmental design and architecture. It's a longer story there, I won't bore you with, but I'm excited you're here with that kind of project in mind.
Yeah, and actually I took Spence class too.
Did you too? Wonder if we were classmates.
Yeah, no, I took that class too, but yes, because the students, they're not bogged down with, lack of a better word, baggage.
Yeah.
Right? Their ideas are very fresh. And so again, like you said, these things happen, they manifest, they start to happen. But Spence was in a very good position to be in city council to make that happen.
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And so, how do we make those partnerships or, become those particular entities ourselves to really give value to what the students are doing at that point. Yeah. No, he was good.
Yeah.
He was really good. So, but yes, I'm always reaching out, we're always reaching out to students in other departments. I've been communicating with Daria over at Idea Forge. She's so busy, so I have to be patient. But it'd be nice to be able to take some of this, because we have our own makerspace called the Sink over by the Home Depot. I'm sorry, I don't know directionally where that is, but over by the Home Depot. But it's mostly focused on wood. It doesn't have a lot of fabrication in terms of steel. And so, but the Idea Forge, it would be a really good start. Because they're already doing a vehicle, but it is based on, petroleum.
Yeah.
And it's more about performance. It's not about user interface. And so if we get the two together, then we can start to understand that as well. So, yeah. So there you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing. And then it'd be great to have reviewers. So if anybody is open to see what the students are doing, I'd love to have you come and have those conversations. We usually do what they call gallery style, so you can have a really one-on-one conversation and not just sit there with 3 people trying to figure out what they want to say. And so the students can have that opportunity. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.